Second Earth. Mark finished reading the pages before Courtney did, but didn't move until she looked up. They both looked at Bobby, who was lying on Mark's bed. They wanted to talk to him, but they wouldn't dare wake him up because he needed the rest. It was a strange feeling. This was their friend. They had known each other since they were little. Things were different now. Yes, this was still Bobby, but he wasn't the same Bobby who had kissed Courtney only a few days before. Could things go back to the way they were? "I'm awake," Bobby said softly. Mark and Courtney jumped up and went to him. Courtney sat on the edge of the bed. Mark paced. "So I guess you got back to the flume on the mountain okay," said Courtney. Bobby sat up, but it was a struggle. Obviously he was sore. Not hurt, just sore. "Yeah, we got some Bedouin horses and they took us most of the way." "What about the Quigs?" asked Mark. "They didn't show, but I think that was because of the nasty ice storm." He pointed to the small cuts on his face. "The wind was blowing hard. It was like being cut by flying needles. Basically, it sucked. Sorry if I messed up your pillows." "It's cool," said Mark. He meant it too. "Who came back with you?" asked Courtney. "Uncle Press?" "Yeah," answered Bobby. "But you know something weird? When we got to that subway station, his motorcycle was waiting for us right where we left it. The helmets, too. How strange is that?" It was strange indeed, because when Mark and Courtney went to the station, the motorcycle wasn't there. Someone must have been keeping it, waiting for Press's return. Mark said, "Yeah, that's strange." He held up Bobby's last journal and added, "But you want to talk about strange?" They all stared at the parchment pages, then burst out laughing. Mark was right. Compared to what Bobby had done on Pendragon, a motorcycle mysteriously disappearing and reappearing was pretty low on the strange scale. It felt good for Bobby to laugh and to be with his friends, yet he had the same awkward feeling that bothered both Courtney and Mark. A lot had happened. He was a different guy. Could he go back and pick up his life where he left off? "What about Lore?" asked Courtney. "Did she stay on Pendragon?" Mark thought he caught a touch of jealousy in her voice, but he decided not to point it out. Bobby stopped laughing. Courtney had touched a raw nerve. "She climbed with us to the top of the mountain," he said softly. "But when we got into the cave where the gate was, she just kept walking and jumped into the flume. No goodbyes, no see you around, no gee it's been swell, nothing. I mean, it's not like we'd become best friends or anything, but we'd been through a lot. There were some things I wanted to say." Obviously this hurt Bobby. He had grown to like Lore, but it didn't seem as if Lore cared about or liked him the same way. There was a long moment of awkward silence. Then Mark raised the key issue that was on everybody's mind. "Bobby," he said tentatively, "there's some crazy stuff in your journals. The deal with the Malago and the Bedouin is only part of it. What about this traveler stuff and flumes that shoot you between time and places? And people who live on territories all over the universe, and Hala. What is Hala? How can every place and everything and every time still exist? And who is this Saint Dane dude? Is he going to show up here someday and do what he did on Pendragon? The stuff you wrote tears apart everything we know about how things work, and I gotta tell you, it's freaking me out." "I wish I could make you feel better," Bobby began, "but it's freaking me out too. I don't know anything more about it than what I wrote in those journals. I wish I could turn back the clock to the other night and tell Uncle Press to find somebody else to help him, but I can't. Part of me is okay with that. I learned some things about myself that are pretty cool. I also found out some things that I gotta change. That's all good. But as for the whole traveler deal, I haven't got a clue." "So what are you gonna do?" asked Courtney. Bobby pulled himself across the bed and stood up. His legs were a little shaky, but otherwise he was okay. "I'm gonna try to get back to normal," he announced with certainty. "If Uncle Press needs help again, he can find somebody else. Would you guys come home with me? It might make things easier." This was the moment Mark and Courtney were dreading. How could they possibly tell Bobby that his family had disappeared? After what he had been through, he didn't deserve this, but still, he had to know. "But Bobby," said Mark nervously, "there's something you should—" Courtney cut him off. "We'll go with you, Bobby," she said. "We want to be there for you." Mark shot Courtney a look, but Courtney didn't back down. She felt there was only one way that Bobby should learn about what had happened, and that was to see it for himself. If they told him, he'd want to see for himself anyway, so Courtney felt it would be better to get the news all at once. It was a short walk to Bobby's house on Linden Place. As they walked along the familiar sidewalks of Stonybrook, Bobby looked around with a smile. He had walked these streets 1,000 times before, but now he had a whole new appreciation for them. He took in every sight, every smell, every sensation that he could. He wrapped himself in the feelings like a comfortable blanket, and it made him feel whole again. He felt so good that he hadn't even allowed himself to think that it was possible to pick up his life where he had left off. Mark and Courtney sensed this. It broke their hearts to know that soon his happy homecoming was going to crash and burn. Then, just before they rounded the final bend that would bring them to 2 Linden Place and the empty lot where Bobby's house used to be, Courtney grabbed Bobby and stopped him. She held him by the shoulders and stared him right in the eye. "You got to know something, Bobby," she said sincerely. "We're here for you." "I know that, Courtney," replied Bobby. Courtney didn't let go of him. She knew that as soon as she did, he'd turn the corner to see that the life he so desperately wanted back wasn't there anymore. "Hey, you okay?" Bobby asked her curiously. Courtney nodded and let him go. Bobby glanced at Mark to try and get a clue as to why Courtney was acting all strange, but Mark looked just as bad as Courtney did. Bobby knew right then that something was wrong. He spun and ran around the corner to get to his house. Mark and Courtney gave each other a nervous glance and followed. When Mark and Courtney rounded the corner, they saw Bobby standing alone on the sidewalk, staring at the empty lot where his house used to be. He didn't move. He didn't shout. It didn't even look like he was breathing. He just stood there and stared. They didn't say anything. They had to let Bobby take the time to get his mind around what he was seeing, or not seeing. Bobby walked forward and stepped onto the spot where his yard used to be. It was the yard he had played in since he was a toddler. It was the yard where he wrestled with Marley. It was the yard that led to the house he had called home for 14 years. It was all gone. "Hey there," came a familiar voice from behind them. Everyone spun to see Uncle Press standing on the sidewalk. He was once again dressed in his jeans and long leather coat. Behind him was a small, black sports car he had just arrived in, a Porsche. Uncle Press always traveled in style. "It's okay, Bobby," said Uncle Press softly. "Try to breathe." Mark and Courtney took a few steps out of the way. Whatever was about to happen, it was between Press and Bobby. They saw that Bobby's eyes were red. He had started to cry, but the sad look turned to one of fury when he saw his uncle. "Where are they?" Bobby said through clenched teeth. "And don't tell me this is the way it was meant to be. I don't want to hear that." "They're fine," Press said soothingly. "They're all fine." Bobby took a few steps toward Press. He was angry, sad, confused, and scared. But most of all, he wanted answered. "Then why aren't they here?" he demanded. "This is the toughest part," said Press. "It was tough for me. It was tough for Alder and for Lore too. But we all had to go through it. I would have told you on Denderon, but you had to see for yourself." "See what? What is happening?" Bobby demanded. Courtney reached out and grabbed Mark's hand for support. Mark didn't resist. "Bobby, your family is gone because it was time for you to leave," said Uncle Press. "They raised you to be the person you are today, but it's time to move on." Bobby took a few steps back as if Press's words had physically hit him. What was he saying? Was it planned for him to go to Denderon from the day he was born? Did his family know about this all along? How could that be? His life had been so normal. Then a realization came to Bobby. "You're not my uncle, are you?" he asked. "No, not in the traditional sense," answered Press. "But I've always looked out for you, and I always will." Bobby turned back to the empty lot and ran to the center. He wanted to find the splinter of wood, a piece of glass, maybe even a piece of old wiffle ball. There had to be something that said he had passed through here, but there was nothing. Then Bobby heard something that came as another surprise. "It will be all right, Pendragon," said another familiar voice. Bobby spun back toward the sidewalk to see that standing next to the car was Lore. She was dressed in denim overalls and a tight pink sleeveless shirt that showed off her powerful shoulders and arms. She even had on Doc Marten black boots. Her long black hair was braided down her back, and she wore a necklace made of small shells. She could have easily passed for a student at Stony Brook High. No one would ever guess that she was actually a warrior from a far-off territory. Courtney looked at Lore and sized her up, head to toe. Mark saw this and made a mental note to give Courtney a hard time later for being jealous. But who could blame her? Mark thought that Lore was even more strikingly beautiful than Bobby had described. She may have been dressed like a suburban girl, but she had the powerful presence of a warrior. Courtney Chetwynd had finally met her match. Bobby walked to Lore. If anyone could tell him the truth, it would be her. "Does this make sense to you?" he asked. "It is starting to," was her answer. "What about your mother?" he asked. "Was Osa your real mother?" "No. I was told the truth before I first went to Denderon," answered Lore. "Osa raised me. She taught me all that I know. She was my mother in every sense, except that she had not given birth to me. But that did not stop me from loving her." Bobby looked down, letting this sink in. On the mountain, continued Lore, I did not say goodbye to you because my mind was elsewhere. Osa's body was already back on Zada. I had to return for the burial ceremony. It was difficult for me. I hope you were not offended. Bobby shook his head. He understood all too well because he now knew what it was like to lose your mother. He looked to Press and asked, So that's it? Travelers don't have families? They don't have lives? They only bounce around the universe looking for trouble? Press smiled and said, You trust me, Bobby, don't you? I think so, said Bobby skeptically, but I'm losing faith fast. Don't, said Press quickly. Believe me when I tell you that as time goes on, this will make sense to you, and I'll make you a promise. You'll see your family again. You'll see your mom and your dad and your sister, Shannon, too. What about Marley? Bobby asked. You'll run with your dog again, too, said Press. But not today. When? Asked Bobby. Press gave him this thought. He may have had the answers to all the questions, but this one eluded him. That's one I can't answer, he said. Bobby looked to Lore, who gave him a slight nod of encouragement, then back to the empty lot. He took a long time to collect his thoughts. Finally, he said, You asked me how I felt before. You want to know how I feel right now? How? Asked Press. I feel like I just found out there's no Santa Claus, he answered. It's not a good feeling. It'll get better, said Press. So what happens now? Asked Bobby. Now you come with us, answered Press. Bobby walked over to Mark and Courtney. He looked at his two friends, and the memories of his life in Stony Brook came flooding back. He wanted nothing more than to turn around and see his house standing there so he could go back to the way things were before, but that was not meant to be. I guess I've got to go, said Bobby. We'll always be here for you, said Courtney as tears began to well in her eyes. Bobby leaned forward and grabbed the two of them in a hug. He tried not to break out in tears. He didn't want to do that, not in front of Lore. But he didn't want to let go of his friends either, because as soon as he did, it would be the final act of letting go of his life here on Earth, Second Earth. Time to go, Bobby, prodded Press gently. Bobby pulled back from his two best friends and looked them in the eye. Mark wiped away a tear, smiled, and said, Hey, don't forget to write. The three of them laughed at this. That went without saying. Are you sure? Asked Bobby. Will you keep my journals? I'd be pissed if you sent them to anyone else, Mark replied as he held up his hand to show Bobby the ring that Osa had given him. Bobby gave a smile of thanks and fought back tears to say, See you guys soon. Goodbye, Bobby, said Courtney. Good luck. Bobby nodded, then turned and headed toward the car. He stopped in front of Lore and looked at the warrior girl who was destined to be his partner. I know you do not want to hear this, Pendragon, she said, but this is the way it was meant to be. Yeah, we'll see, said Bobby with skepticism. He gave one last look to the empty lot where his house used to be, then slid into the back of the Porsche. Lore looked at Mark and Courtney. Courtney stood up a little straighter. Lore chuckled. Then she too got in the car. Keep his journals safe, Press said to Mark and Courtney. He may need them again someday. Mark and Courtney nodded a promise. Press then jogged around the car and hopped behind the wheel. With the roar of the engine, the little sports car blasted away from the curb and flew down the street, headed for somewhere. Mark and Courtney watched until it was out of sight and the sound died away. They stood there for a long time after, not sure what to do. Finally, Mark said, There's no Santa Claus? Both of them laughed. It felt good, but it hid their true feelings. Courtney said, You'll call me if... Soon as the next one comes in, promised Mark. Then the two of them walked away from the empty lot, split up, and headed to their homes. Mark went right to his bedroom and waited for another journal from Bobby. The others had come pretty regularly, and he expected his ring to start moving with the telltale quiver any second, but it didn't. He stayed awake most of the night staring at the ring, willing it to move, but it didn't. Courtney called him twice a day to see if Bobby had written, but kept getting the same answer. Nothing yet. Whenever she saw Mark in school, she would make eye contact as if to ask anything, but Mark would always answer with a shrug and a shake of his head. Days passed. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, with nothing from Bobby. Mark and Courtney realized that they couldn't live their lives around waiting for his next message, so they drifted apart. Besides, their friendship with Bobby, they really had nothing in common. Courtney went back to playing volleyball and led the Stony Brook team to the county finals, the men's team, of course. Mark went back to being Mark. He still ate too many carrots and spent most of his time huddled over books in the library. There was one big change in his life, though. Andy Mitchell didn't bother him anymore. Courtney didn't know it, but she became Mark's guardian angel, at least when it came to Andy Mitchell. The investigation to find the Pendragons continued, but they found nothing. Sergeant D'Angelo and Captain Hirsch would sometimes call Mark or Courtney to ask if they had heard anything, but the answer was always the same: no. Even if they wanted to tell the truth, neither of them could begin to figure out what to say. Mark and Courtney never forgot about Bobby. He popped into their thoughts at least once a day. But the more time that passed without a word, the less he stayed on their minds. It made sense. They had to get on with their own lives. The times when they thought of Bobby were usually triggered by seeing things that reminded them of their friend. Mark would play Nintendo football and remember the times that Bobby kicked his butt at the very same game. Courtney would hear a comedian say something goofy on TV, and she'd laugh because she knew it would have made Bobby laugh. One time, Mark sat in the stands during gym watching the guys play basketball, and it made him think of how great Bobby was at the game. And that's when it happened. The ring twitched. At first, Mark didn't know what it was, but when he looked down, he saw the familiar glow coming from the stone. Mark nearly wet his pants with excitement. He ran out of the stands and right through the game. It didn't matter to him that he totally disrupted play and was getting yelled at by every guy on the court. He had to get out of there fast, and he had to find Courtney. He found her in the girls' gym next door. She was taking a class on combatives and was in the middle of a judo match. With very little effort, she picked up her opponent and threw her on her back with a loud, sickening thud. Then, just as she was helping her victim to her feet, Mark ran into the gym and yelled, "Courtney!" Everyone turned to look at the mad dweeb. Courtney locked eyes with him and instantly knew the deal. She quickly bowed to her opponent and ran to Mark. They didn't have to say a word. They knew what to do. The two of them headed right for Mark's fortress of solitude, the boys' bathroom on the 3rd floor. Courtney wasn't shy. She barged in ahead of Mark. No sooner did they get inside than Mark took off the ring and put it on the ground. The ring twitched, the crystal lights flashed, and the familiar process began. The little ring grew larger, and with a final blinding flash, it was over. On the floor was a roll of paper, but this one looked different than the others. It was a light green color, rather than the yellowed pages they were used to. There was a tie around the roll, but rather than a piece of brown leather, this looked like some kind of dark green plant-like material. Mark pulled it off and carefully unrolled the pages. They were roughly the same size as the others, but these were oddly shaped. There were no squared edges. Mark felt the texture. They didn't appear to be paper at all. These pages were sort of large, dried leaves that were sort of rubbery and waterproof. "You ready?" asked Courtney. "My hands are shaking," replied Mark. Then the two of them looked at Bobby's newest journal. To be continued.